last week we talked about the first half of the tribulation, and today we're going to talk about what's known as the middle portion of that period. And then next week we're going to talk about the second coming and the end, the last 3.5 years in the 7-year tribulation. And then finally, after that, then we're going to talk about the second coming, the millennium and eternity in the final class. So today we're going to talk about the middle of the tribulation period. So what is the middle of the tribulation period? So we know that Daniel's 70th week is a 7-year period of time. That's because Daniel's 70th week is the 70th year in the tribulation period, and each of those weeks are 7 years, and so this is the 70th and the final week. And what we talked about last week is that you can literally take the book of Revelation, a majority part of the book of Revelation, and put it right over this time period in Daniel's 70th week. So again, Revelations chapters 2 and 3 are talking about the church period. And that covers what's known as the gap between the 69th week and the 70th week. So Revelations chapters 2 and 3 is the seven churches are actually 7 physical churches, 7 literal churches, but they're also talking about 7 church ages. And then in Revelation chapter 4, after John is receiving the letter to the 7 churches, what happens? John hears a voice, says, "Come up here." And so John is caught up into heaven in Revelation chapter 4. And then in Revelations chapters 4 and 5, John is an eyewitness. He's telling us what he's seeing. He's describing the throne of God. He's describing the angels. He's describing all the other angels and the environments that are taking place in Revelation 4 and 5. But in Revelation chapter 5, he sees the throne of God, and he sees in the hand of God a scroll which no man can open. And then John begins to weep because no one can open the scroll. Then one of the elders tells him, "Look, behold, the Lamb, he has conquered, and he is able to." So the Lamb takes the scroll out of the hand of God, and the Lamb begins to open the scroll. And that's where we begin Revelation chapter 6, when the Lamb begins to open the scroll, and that begins the 70th week of Daniel. And so what do we see in that 70th week is the beginning of that. So again, I want to go over the background of how do we get to the 70 weeks, okay? So remember, in Daniel chapter 9, the angel Gabriel comes to Daniel. He says, "Daniel, I'm going to give you skill to understand." And then in Daniel chapter 9, the angel Gabriel says, "Daniel, from the first day that Daniel, you're greatly beloved." And then earlier it says in Daniel chapter 10, "From the first day, Daniel, that you set your heart to understand and know your God, your words were heard. I've come to answer your words." And so then he tells Daniel, 77s are determined upon your people. And so we know from the earlier parts of the 70 weeks of Daniel that the 77s begins with the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 8. And then that's where the 70 weeks begin in 444 BC, in the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes, to the 69th week. The 69th week corresponds with the death of Messiah, as is foretold in the 70 weeks of Daniel. "And Messiah the prince shall be cut off, but not for himself." But then it tells us there's still 1 week left, and it says, "After the Messiah the prince is cut off, the people of a prince who is to come." This is very important. This is kind of like foundational understanding. "The people of a prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with the flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined." That prince who is to come is future tense. So at the end of the 69 weeks, the people of the prince who is to come is future tense, destroy the city of Jerusalem and destroy the temple. Who are the people? They were the Romans, the Roman Empire, because we know, if you look on this handout here, you'll see this little arch here, that's called the Arch of Titus. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but the Arch of Triomphe in France was actually modeled after the Arch of Titus. It was modeled after the Arch of Titus because the Arch of Titus was the Roman emperor. And when Napoleon, he wanted to be like Caesar. He wanted to be like the Roman emperor. And so he made the Arc of Triomphe in Paris 2 times higher and 2 times wider than the Arch of Titus. But the Arch of Titus was celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem. And it's actually a pictograph monument commemorating or validating and clearly signifying the end of the 69th week, because after the Messiah was cut off, what happens? The people of the prince who was to come destroy the city and the sanctuary. So the Roman Empire, they destroyed the city and the sanctuary, and the prince who is to come is future tense. So it's linking this future prince who is to come with the people who destroyed the city and the sanctuary. And this is where the 27th verse comes in, because it says, then he shall, again, future tense, he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. That's the 7-year period. That's why Daniel's 70th week is a 7-year period, because it's the confirming of the covenant with many for 1 week. So the many's, basically it's going to be a peace agreement with the whole world. And what part of this peace agreement allows, it allows the Jews to rebuild the third temple. How do we know that it allows them to rebuild the third temple? Because halfway into that agreement, 3.5 years, because it's a 7-year agreement, so halfway into it, it says, but in the middle of the week, in the middle of the 3.5 years, what happens? He shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. So it's very simple. In order to have an end to sacrifice and offering, you have to have a beginning to sacrifice and offering. And the only place in the whole world that the Jews can have sacrifice and offering was on the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock now sits. So so at 3.5 years later, the people of the prince who is to come is going to stop sacrifice. In the beginning, he allows sacrifice, but in the 3.5 years later, he stops sacrifice. Okay. Then what happens? It says, then the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, also known as the Abomination of Desolation. That's when the Antichrist is going to go into the temple and he's going to desolate the temple. He's going to proclaim himself God. And this actually happened before Jesus, because Jesus talks about it in a future tense. We're going to talk about this here in a second, but I just want to actually lay the groundwork before we get into the middle of the tribulation period, so everybody understands what's going on. And that's going to bring about the final period, the second half of the tribulation, which we'll talk about next week. But in the middle of the tribulation period, in the middle of Daniel's 70th week, he causes an end to sacrifice and offering. And then it says, even until a consummation. Again, what's a consummation? A consummation is a burning, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out. So the picture of something being poured out on the desolate. Who are the desolate? Those who are left behind, those who are in the world at this period of time, is what's going to happen. Now, I just want everybody to see, just before I came here, I just did a couple of searches on Google for the third temple, okay? So this very first one is a book that was written about the coming rebuilding of the third temple, and it was a fictional book, but it talks about the events taking place from a Jewish perspective that lead to it. Now, this guy who wrote the book is not in favor of it. He just sees the writing on the wall. He sees the movement of the Jewish people towards rebuilding a third temple, and he says he sees the darkness that's going to come about. So, next article here is the water libation reenactment takes place in preparation of the third temple. So, part of the Feast of Israel was the idea of the water libation, which was part of the Feast of Tabernacles in Leviticus chapter 23, the last of the 7 feasts. And so they're reenacting the water libation. They're training. They're going through the motions to say how they're going to do it when in preparation of the third temple. And this article was not too long ago. Then again, they have actually rebuilt the Ark of the Covenant in preparation of the third temple, made out of solid gold. Took 3 years to build, made from acacia wood exactly as the Bible describes. Again, why is that? Because it's in preparation of building the third temple. Now, here's our Secretary of Defense. He also talks about, he floats the third temple in an unearthed speech. This was like a couple of days ago. I talked about this last week, but people are finding out that other people, even the U.S. Defense Secretary, is talking about rebuilding the third temple. That's significant, because the only way the Jewish people are going to rebuild the third temple is with military force basically giving them the agreement to allow them to rebuild the third temple, because it's not going to be rebuilt without some political power behind it. Because why? Because it entails taking down the third most holy place of Islam, the Dome of the Rock. And that's not going to happen without consternation and all kinds of worldwide conflict taking place. So what we see this moving. Now here's an article. The Israeli Knesset member calls for building the third temple at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And in this article, the individual, he says, he called for a third temple in the place of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the occupied East Jerusalem. He says, I really hope that all the Jewish people will have come next week on Monday to offer their Passover sacrifice in Jerusalem. Yitzhak Pendris, a member of the extremist United Torah Judaism, said in a TV interview. And then he says he has plans to seek to change the status quo at the mosque by allowing Israeli control over the site and opening it to Jewish worshipers and the Israeli public, the broadcaster said. So, I mean, the whole goal is to move toward the people towards rebuilding the third temple. And this is what's taking place. But in doing this, we're going to be beginning the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And so, you know, I'm a big believer in learning about history. And so one of the books I recommend, if anybody wants to see how serious war is, but how war moves forward regardless of what might seem what people want, is The Story of World War II by Donald Miller. It's like 25 hours. I listened to it. It's an amazing book. And you'll see how all the events that are taking place in the world are moving in that direction. And just to even understand like the direction of everything going, this is the Nazis. The Nazis actually designed an aircraft for bombing New York, and it looked just like the space shuttle. And they had all kinds of plans. This is in addition to the V-2 rocket. So all these things are taking place even 60, 70 years ago. But we're all moving in that direction. The technology is increasing and increasing. And the amazing thing about what we're going to talk about today is that as actually Revelation chapters 11 through 13 actually document the technological advances that are in place today that weren't in place when the book was written. It was like almost like it's impossible to see how the guys 2,000 years ago would be talking about what's taking place right now. And we're going to talk about that, which is pretty exciting. For anybody who says, look, I don't believe the Bible. The Bible's just a book of mystery, a book of mythology. It's ridiculous. You're going to see it being fulfilled right in front of you. The technology that we have today is described in the Bible. But just to kind of give everybody a heads up, I want to talk about the beginning of Revelation chapter 11. So if you remember in Revelations chapters 8 and 9, we have what's Revelations chapter 6, 8, and 9. In Revelation 6, we have the seal judgments. In Revelations 8 and 9, we have the trumpet judgments. And then in Revelation chapter 10, we see a bright angel, and this angel then talks about the two witnesses. And he says, I will give power to my two witnesses. And that a lot of people feel that angel in Revelation chapter 10 is Jesus being talked about. He's described standing in the sun. And these two witnesses are the mouthpiece of God on the earth. And this is kind of like the focus of Revelation chapters 11 and 12, these two witnesses, who are they? We're going to talk more about that in a second. But just so you understand, it says, I give power to my two witnesses, and they prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. These have power, okay, to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over the waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. And when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war with them and overcome them and kill them, So now, it's very important to understand the identity and the purpose and the ministry of the two witnesses in understanding the book of Revelation. So we'll talk about that more in a second. But in that same Revelation, in the middle part of the Revelation, it talks about a beast. We're going to see a beast that's described in Revelation chapter 9 that relates to the book of Daniel. So in Revelation chapter 9, we read this. Revelation chapter 13, we read this. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and like the feet of a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth, and to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. Now, the one thing with the book of Revelation, in order to really understand the book of Revelation, you have to understand also the book of Daniel. So in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has a dream, and in his dream he sees these four beasts. And Daniel himself doesn't understand who or what these 4 beasts are. But later on, an angel tells Daniel what these 4 beasts are. So the first beast that Daniel sees is like a man, and a heart is like a lion, but then it stands on its feet, and a man's heart is given into it. Then the next beast he sees is a bear, and the bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. Then he sees a leopard with 4 heads. And then finally he sees a beast that's so strange, it's described as a dragon or a beast with iron claws, stomping and subduing the whole earth. And Daniel really doesn't understand what this is. Then the angel tells Daniel, these are kingdoms. These are kingdoms that are going to come upon the earth. These are kingdoms that are going to come upon the earth. And he goes through the list of the kingdoms. And so, but then finally he tells Daniel that the final kingdom is a united kingdom. And he tells Daniel that it's a kingdom of 10 kings. And he says it has this, it's a parallel to this. It says the 10 horns on this kingdom are 10 kings that are united in one final kingdom. And this is the final kingdom on the earth. So here in Revelation, we see a combination of all the beasts that are in Daniel chapter 7 united in this one kingdom. Now it goes back, it says, then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. So the sea is the Mediterranean Sea, which we'll talk here more in a second. The Mediterranean Sea that's right here, okay, it rising out, and said it had 7 heads and 10 horns. So we know from the book of Daniel that the 7 heads represent 7 of the 10 kingdoms, and the 10 horns represent 7 kings. We know this also from Revelation chapter 17. 10 kings are going to be united in one kingdom. And it says, on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. So just so you understand that this is talking about a kingdom with a power and authority, it tells us in verse 2, and the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and its feet like a bear, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth, and to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. So literally, the dragon is Satan. Satan's transferring his power and authority to this power, to this kingdom. And so that's important to understand the background of what we're going to be talking about, because the kingdom of the Antichrist is a physical kingdom. The Antichrist himself is a political leader. He's a military leader, a political leader, just like we have today, just like an Adolf Hitler, just like a Mussolini, just like a Stalin, just like a Trump, just like Obama, just like Roosevelt, Washington. These are all political leaders that have been put in authority. But the difference is the Antichrist is the final world leader who's going to have the final world kingdom. So again, let's go over the background here, just so everybody understands. Revelations chapter 6 and 10, we have the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets. And how are these 7 seals and these 7 trumpets being administered? They're being administered through the voice of the 2 witnesses. The 2 witnesses are in Jerusalem, and they're the ones who are proclaiming God's judgment on the earth during the first half of the tribulation period. Now, where else do we see this in the Bible, something similar to this? Does anybody know? Where else in the Old Testament do we see this? Egypt. Who in Egypt is doing something similar? Remember Moses and Aaron? They're standing and they're bringing down God's judgment on Egypt, and they're proclaiming why this is happening, and they're giving Pharaoh an opportunity of letting my people go, but Pharaoh doesn't. And then finally the last judgment is what? Death of the firstborn of Egypt, and that's where we get Passover from. So we're going to see that the 2 witnesses, they're in Jerusalem, and they're bringing down God's judgment in the world, and they're hated by the world, and they're going to be killed. And then the second half of the tribulation are what's known as the 7 bowl judgments, where the 7 angels with 7 bowls come out, and they're going to administer God's judgment on the world, all leading to the second half, the return of Christ. Now, the first question is, who are these 2 witnesses in the book of Revelation? So they play a very prominent role in the book of Revelation because it's through them that God is judging the world. Well, we know who one of those 2 witnesses are because it tells us in the book of Malachi. It says, "Behold, I send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction." So what happened? Who's Elijah? Well, if you remember Elijah, there are 2 people in the Bible who didn't die. Elijah and Enoch. Elijah was taken up into heaven in a chariot of fire. And Elijah is promised to come back before the destruction, before God's desolation on the earth. So when John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, what does that mean? John the Baptist came to fulfill the role that Elijah would have fulfilled if Israel would have accepted Jesus as Messiah. John the Baptist came as an Elijah substitute at the first coming. But when Israel rejected Jesus as Messiah, that's how Elijah would have, that's the power and the spirit of Elijah that John the Baptist fulfilled. But in the second coming, Elijah is literally coming. He's going to come and he's going to walk the streets of Jerusalem. And it tells us that he has a ministry, okay? He has a ministry, and what is his ministry? It's the restoration of the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. So it's like reunification. So I'm kind of like trying to guess, like, what kind of ministry would this be? Is he going to have like a talk show in Israel? Okay, I'm just kind of trying to, what does that mean? How's this man going to restore the hearts? He's got to have some way to communicate to people who are in Israel and maybe to the whole world about heart restoration. Now is he going to say, I'm Elijah? Probably not. I don't think necessarily. But the Bible's telling us that that he's going to somehow communicate to restoration of hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to the fathers. It's identifying him, okay? So, but who's the second person? Well, there's speculation that the second person is Enoch. Some people speculate it's Enoch. I personally believe it's Moses, because Moses also had a mysterious passing. We see this in the book of Jude, where Satan was, debating with the body about the body of Moses, and then we see Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration. We see this here in Luke chapter 9, verse 29 to 31. It says, as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, and who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. So here, Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Now, we have two witnesses, Peter and James, or Peter and John. They're witnessing this event, and they're telling us what's going on. And so they're there communicating with Jesus, okay, about his departure. So it would make sense that they're communicating about probably the ministry, the things that are going on, but they're there for a reason for us to see them with Jesus at that point. And so I talked about this. This is the 70th week. So again, it's important to understand the breakdown. So the breakdown is Revelation chapters 4 through 10 is 1,260 days. Why is it 1,260 days? Because 3.5 years is 42 months. And 42 months times 30 is 1,260. And the book of Revelation tells us 1,260, okay? So that's how we know it's talking about a 1,260-day period. It's not speculation. It literally says 1,260 days. And we can literally just do the math. 42 months times 30 is 1,260. 3.5 years is 1,260. So the middle of the tribulation period, and we know this, the middle of the tribulation period is a 30-day overlap. We know this from Daniel chapter 12, okay? Because it tells us in Daniel chapter 12 there's a 1,290 day. So the 1,290 from the abomination of desolation until the second coming is 1,290 days according to Revelation chapter 12. So that 30 days added to the 1,260 is there's an overlap, and that overlap is the middle of the tribulation period. And that's covered in Revelation chapters 11 through 13. And that's what we're going to talk about, 11 through 13 today. So the second half is from the abomination of desolation until the second coming, and that's 1,260 days, or 1,290 when you include the 30. And that's covered in Revelation chapters 14 through 19, and that's what we're going to talk about next week. Let me stop there and see if anybody has any questions or any comments. Okay. So you guys have this chart. It's in several of the handouts. But here's a real simple breakdown, okay? So we have the time gap, and we have the middle period, and that middle period is, the focus of that middle period is the abomination of desolation, which we'll talk about here in a second. So it's important understanding it. So again, let me just do a quick review. So we have the four horses of in Revelation chapter 5 and 6. We have as the Lamb begins to open the seals, the first seal is the white horse, which was a false peace. Then the second seal was the red horse, which was war on the earth. Then the third seal was what happens after you have war. You have scarcity of food, because the third seal is a black horse, and the rider on him had a scale, and in the scale he said a denarius. He had a denarius for three omers of barley and one for an omer of wheat. And then what followed the black horse was the pale horse, and it tells us that 1/4 of the earth dies in this. 1/4 of the earth's population. So just so everybody understands how severe this is. So what do we read about in the first half of the tribulation period? In the first half of the tribulation period, 1/4 of the earth's population is killed at the start of the tribulation period. 1/4 of the earth's population. So it's not like it's a minor event. It's not like there's no wrath, there's no tribulation. And I'll talk more about this in a second. But it's telling us how severe the first half of the tribulation is. It's called tribulation. And then it tells us in the fifth seal, when the fifth seal is open, we see under the altar the souls of those who are killed for their testimony. And what does that mean? That means that people who are believers are going to be killed in the first half of the tribulation period. Why? Because we know from the rest of the book of Revelation that there's a false religion coming. And I'm going to give you the logic for this false religion, okay? The logic's going to be in this time in the world that there's so much division because of religion. Do you remember that song that they played at Jimmy Carter's funeral? That song of the Beatles? That religion? You know that, I forgot, let me get the words. Imagine. So if you actually listen to the words of that Beatles song, Imagine, it talks about no religion. It talks about the elimination of religion. Because why? Because religion is causing all the division. So if we could just eliminate religion, we're going to have peace. And that's what the attempt. So one of the things that's going to happen is there's going to be a world religion that's going to be forced upon the world to save the world. And anybody who doesn't agree with it is going to be killed. And the Bible tells us that people are going to die. Why? Because in the book of Revelation, in the fifth seal, we see that those who are killed, they're under the altar and they're crying out, "Oh Lord, how long until you avenge our lives, our deaths?" And they were killed for their testimony and the word of God. So that's why they were killed. And then we're going to see these two men who are in Jerusalem. They're bringing down God's judgment upon the whole world. And so as a result of them bringing down God's judgment, and what's God's judgment in this first part? According to the book of Revelation, there's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be asteroids that are going to strike the earth. 1/3 of the water is going to be polluted. 1/3 of the life in the seas are going to die. 1/3 of the grass is going to burn. All these things. And there's going to be earthquakes. There's going to be volcanic activity. And this is all proceeding from the mouth of the two witnesses. So, and you can see the first trump, then the trumpet judgment. 1/3 of the ocean, life and ships are destroyed. 1/3 of the fresh water is contaminated. 1/3 of the sky is darkened. Then in Revelation chapter 9, we have two demonic events. One are these demonic beings that sting people for 5 months, and that people want to die, but they can't die. But that's in preparation of the next trumpet, which is 1/3 of humanity dies when 200 million demonic beings are unleashed. So we see this in Revelation chapter 9. Now, so if 1/4 of the earth's population dies from the seal judgments, and 1/3 of the remaining population dies from this. So what does that mean? So that means that over half the earth's population is dead in the first half of the tribulation period. Half of the earth's population. So it's not like it's a minor thing taking place. It's very severe what's going on in the earth. And again, God is bringing judgment because of how people are treating his saints, his servants. So that's why it's important understanding how the book of Revelation fits over Daniel's 70th week. So Revelations chapters 6 through 9 take place in the first half of the tribulation, and Revelations chapters 11 through 13, kind of mixed with 10, take place in the middle of the tribulation, and Revelations chapters 14 to 19 take place in the second half of the tribulation. So now let's look at these two witnesses. So Jerusalem becomes the focus of the whole world. Just like it's the focus of the world now, it's going to accelerate. As time goes on, the focus of Jerusalem is going to accelerate. Why? Because the Jews are going to refuse to unite with the world. the Jews are going to say, no, we're not conforming to the world religion. And so they're going to be persecuted. And on top of that, we're going to have two witnesses. I really believe it's Elijah and Moses. They're going to be in Jerusalem. They're the ones who are going to be speaking and proclaiming God's judgment in the world. And in addition to those two witnesses, we're going to have another 144,000 Jews who are going to become believers. And they're going to be proclaiming the gospel. Remember, the baton is being passed from the church to Israel. So in the tribulation period, Israel takes the baton of the gospel, and Israel is the voice that's proclaiming the good news to a fallen and lost world. It's through the witness of Israel, because Israel's had that responsibility at the beginning, but Israel shirked that responsibility. Israel rejected the Messiah, and so God put Israel on hold, and he grafted in the Gentiles, you and me, to be his mouthpiece in the world, to proclaim the good news to a fallen world. But that job in the beginning was Israel's job. That was the job of Israel, to proclaim the good news to a fallen world. But now, when the church, and again, I believe the rapture takes place before the tribulation, and then that baton is handed back to Israel, and then Israel is now proclaiming it. So we see the two witnesses. So another good point to understand is Zechariah chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. Zechariah 14, a little background on the book of Zechariah. Zechariah was written 520 years before the birth of Jesus, and it's considered part of what's known as the Second Temple period, because there's First Temple, Second Temple, because when the Second Temple was built. So Zechariah was a prophet who returned back from Persia, and he returned to Jerusalem. And Zechariah is considered like the book of Revelation, like the Apocalypse in the Old Testament. Daniel and Zechariah are both books that talk about the second coming. Next to the book of Isaiah, the book of Zechariah talks the most about the Messiah and the reign, the rule of the Messiah and the kingdom of God. So in the 14th chapter of Zechariah, again, it's talking about the coming of the Lord, and it tells us, in anticipation of that, it tells us, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst." Look at verse 2, Zechariah 14, verse 2. It says, "I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem, and the city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished," that's another word for raped, "half the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So there's talk about a coming conflict, and this is what's known as during the Abomination of Desolation, when Jerusalem is going to be attacked by the armies of the Antichrist. Because, again, why? Because Israel refuses to submit to the world authority. They refuse to submit to a world religion, and they're going to be hated by the world. And so, again, this is taking place in the middle of the tribulation period, Revelation chapters 10 to 13. So let's look at another verse, like in Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 to 5. It says, "For behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, and all the proud, yes, all who do wickedly, shall be stubble." So it's talking about in Malachi, again, it's talking about the coming of the Lord. But notice how it's talking, what's going to happen. It's the day of the Lord's coming. It's going to be like burning like an oven. And so it's God's punishment on the earth. And it says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." So this is Elijah the prophet. So what we see here, and we see the picture of Elijah, of Moses and Elijah meeting with Jesus. And we see this in Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 31. Now, notice what happens. So now we got a background on these two witnesses. And look at Revelation 11:3. It says, "I will give power to my two witnesses." So God's giving power to these two individuals. Just like God gave power to Moses. When Moses brought down God's judgment on the house of Pharaoh, it's not Moses himself, but God's like transferring his power. So Moses becomes the focal point of God's judgment. And so in the same way, these two individuals are God's witnesses. Now, why are they witnesses? Because they're proclaiming God's ministry, God's words to a world. Now, at the first, the world doesn't really pay attention to them. But what happens is they will prophesy for 1,260 days. So they're in the first half of the tribulation period. And these two have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And they have power over the waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. And when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. So they're going to be dead. When are they going to die? At the end of 1,260 days. So when is 1,260 days? 3.5 years. So their ministry begins at the beginning of the 1,260 days. And for the next 1,260 days, they are bringing down God's judgments on the world. So I can kind of like, almost like picture it. These two guys, I mean, that right now, you know, if the tribulation were to start next week or next month or next year, I could just imagine them right now, maybe at a coffee shop in Tel Aviv. Unrecognizable. I mean, in how they would appear, it's kind of like, just like Paul. You know, Paul was an Orthodox Jew, and he had all the characteristics of an Orthodox Jew. But when Paul became a believer and he realized the freedom he had in Christ, he took upon, like he easily took upon himself the same mannerisms to the people that he was ministering to. Paul says, to the Greek, I became a Greek. To the Jew, I became a Jew. I became all things to all people that I might win more to Christ. So in the same way, I can kind of like almost imagine Moses and Elijah having a ministry in Israel before the tribulation period, or at the beginning. I'm kind of, again, this is speculation because I like to speculate. I like to try to put a modern day context on it. That these two guys would be there and they would be like talking about fathers and the relationship with their children and the importance of children having a relationship with their fathers and communicating this message into Israel. And then the rapture happens, or then after the rapture happens, or while this is going on, they're communicating this, and then the world starts turning against God. And so what happens is they're the ones who are given power. They're given authority, and they're going to vocalize God's judgment on the earth. And so the world's going to gradually become more angry and more angry as time goes on, because it tells us, it says, they have power over the waters to turn them to blood. So that's when we look at the seal and the trumpet judgments. One of the seal judgments is the waters turning into blood. Again, that's happening because they're vocalizing it. And the world begins to blame these two guys for what's taking place on the earth. And the world begins to hate these two individuals for what's taking place on the earth, because they're God's witness. That's why it's important, kind of like getting this chart here. It's like their ministry, they're killed at the end of the 1,260 days. And we're going to see in Revelation chapter 11, they're killed and then they're taken up into heaven. But they're bringing down the seal judgments and they're bringing down the trumpet judgments, because again, God is vocalizing the judgments. Just like Moses and Aaron were in the land of Egypt and they were talking, and they were like, and they were actually hated by the Jews or the Israelites in the land of Egypt because they were making it hard on them. Because when they were vocalizing this judgment, then Pharaoh got mad at the Israelites and he said, okay, you got too much time on your hand. I'm not going to give you any hay for you to make straw. So you got to go collect your own hay if you want to make, but I want the same number of bricks. And then they start getting mad at Moses and Aaron because Moses and Aaron are getting Pharaoh mad at them. And they just want to eat their leeks and their onions and move on with their life. And here's Moses and Aaron interrupting things. The same thing's probably going to happen at this point because they're bringing down God's judgment. So we read Then in Revelation 11 and 4, it says, these are the two olive trees, the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours enemies. And if anybody wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. So these two guys have power. Now, it tells us that these are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. Where else do we see that? We see that in Zechariah chapter 4. Zechariah chapter 4, Zechariah sees two lampstands in heaven. And again, what's the purpose of a lamp? Lamp is to illuminate and to bring light. And so these two men, they're bringing a light. They're like illuminating God's judgment in the fallen world. They have power. So people, where else do we see the scene where someone wants to come after the prophet and the prophet is able to kill them? Where else does that happen in the Old Testament? Elijah, remember? They came after him and they send 50, and Elijah brings down fire. In the same way that these, again, one of them is Elijah, okay? One of them is Elijah. We know that because of Malachi chapter 4. One of them is Elijah. And so if anybody wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours enemies. So they have the ability to proclaim judgment on the people who want to harm them. Again, this is taking place in the spiritual realms, okay? So these two guys are causing an ire to take place in the world because they're bringing down God's judgment on the world. They're like causing the world problems. And so the world's political leader is the Antichrist, the descendant, the same one who allowed the Jews to rebuild the third temple and made an agreement allowing them to rebuild the third temple and allowing them to start sacrificing again, okay? That's why he makes an agreement with many. And it says, now he's the one who's going to oppose them. It says, and I saw one of his heads, and then we see this in Revelation 13, one of his heads as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world marveled and followed the beast, okay? So the beast, we're going to see more about the beast here in a second. The beast is a political leader. He's a political leader over a kingdom, and that kingdom is called the beast, and the political leader is called the beast, okay? And there's a unique characteristic about him is that he was somehow killed, okay? But then, because it says he had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world marveled and followed the beast. So this guy is a political leader. He's got a great following. He was killed and brought back to life, okay? And the whole world followed him. So again, because why? Because the world is looking for leadership. But God has his two witnesses also proclaiming a message to the fallen world. Notice what happens. It tells us in Revelation verses 7 and 8, when they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them and overcome them and kill them. So we know who kills these two guys is the beast, is the Antichrist. He's going to kill these two guys. And he's only going to kill them when their ministry is done. And it says, look, it says, when they finish their testimony. So just like they have a testimony, you and I have a testimony. Our testimony is like who we are and what makes us who we are. And that's your testimony. That's why earlier in Revelation chapter 6, when we see the fifth seal is open, we saw under the altar the souls of them who were killed for their testimony and for the word of God. We see later in Revelation 15, people who are killed for their testimony. That's like the ability to tell people who you are in Jesus Christ and be willing to die for that. So these two individuals, they're killed for their testimony. And it tells us that the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead body, now this is the cool part, their dead bodies will lie in the street of that great city, which is spiritually called Sodom. talking about Jerusalem and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified. See, Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, okay? So it's telling us that when they finish their testimony, they're going to be killed, and their dead bodies are going to lay in the streets of Jerusalem, okay? Now, what happens? As a result of this, we're going to see that Satan seems to resurrect. So, but here's the cool part. In Revelation chapter 11, verses 9 and 10, it says, for 3.5 days, for 3.5 days, some from the peoples, tribes, and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse them to be buried, or placed in a tomb. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and make merry and exchange presents with presents, because these two had been a torment to those who dwell on the earth. So what we see is the world's going to be celebrating them, okay? The news is going to be broadcast all over the world about their dead bodies, and everybody's going to be celebrating these two guys. Like, say, for example, some celebration like this, okay? And they're going to be rejoicing. They're going to be exchanging gifts with one another because, okay, these two guys who have been tormenting the earth. So that's why we know it's at the end, because they're killed at the end of their ministry, and the ministry was 1,260 days. So 12 from the beginning to the ministry, end of their ministry is 1,260 days, 3.5 years. So that's how we know their ministry takes place in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. That's why there's wrath in the first 3.5 years, but it's not as bad as the wrath in the second 3.5 years. But the wrath in the first 3.5 years is not like it's a cakewalk, because we know that half the earth's population dies, according to the book of Revelation, in the first 3.5 years. And so the beast is also, the Bible tells us that there's a deadly wound for the beast, and that he was also killed, but then somehow he's brought back to life. But notice what happens to these two witnesses, okay? So the world is watching their dead bodies lay in the streets of Jerusalem. Now ask yourself the question, 2,000 years ago, how could the whole world, from every tribe, every tongue, every language, watch two dead bodies in Jerusalem and everybody starts celebrating? It's actually describing the internet, it's describing satellite television, because their dead bodies are laying in the streets of Jerusalem and everybody's exchanging gifts with one another. But then it says, now, after 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they ascended into heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. So their dead bodies are laying in the streets of Jerusalem. They're not being buried on purpose, because the world is kind of like gloating over these two guys who did all these things and brought all these judgments and spoke these judgments. Look at them. What are they doing now? What's up now? You know, they're kind of the world saying to them. And all of a sudden, what happens? They stand on their feet. The whole cameras all over the world are probably broadcasting this. They stand on their feet and they hear a loud voice, come up here. Now, this is an example of God's mercy. Because what is God doing? God is actually allowing these two guys to be witnesses, because they're imitating, they're showing the resurrection, because their ministry was Jesus' ministry was for 3 years. Their ministry was for 3.5 years. They had a public execution like Jesus. Jesus was publicly executed outside of the walls of Jerusalem. They're executed in the streets of Jerusalem. Jesus had miracles, healings, okay? Their miracles were judgments. They were bringing down God's judgments upon the world. There's a public reaction. When Jesus was killed, the world was cheering, okay? These two guys, the world is cheering. Jesus was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. there on the streets of Jerusalem. Their bodies are rotting on the streets of Jerusalem. People are probably spitting on them and throwing things at it, just like mocking their dead bodies for 3.5 days. And then Jesus resurrected on the third day. And these two guys resurrect on the third day. Jesus ascends into heaven from the Mount of Olives. These two ascend into heaven from Jerusalem. And why is that important? Because God is showing his mercy. God is giving mankind an opportunity to change. The whole world is witnessing it. So people, as long as you're alive, you have an opportunity to make a decision. And so the world has an opportunity to still make a decision. The end hasn't come yet. People can still choose at this point. And that's what a witness is about. They are God's witnesses to a fallen world. Because the next thing that happens is the abomination of desolation. So what is the abomination of desolation? So in history, the Jewish festival of Hanukkah comes out of the abomination of desolation. And during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, which was about 167 BC, about 200 years before the time of Christ, okay, there was a Greek ruler, and he wanted the Jewish people to all conform their belief system and become Greeks. He didn't want any more division. He wanted it's very similar to what's going to happen here. He wanted everybody to be part of the Greek religion. So what did he do? He went to the temple in Jerusalem, and he installed a statue of Zeus, and he sacrificed a pig. And he wanted all the Jews to do this. And so the Jews rebelled against him. And they rebelled against him, and this became known as the event that this Antiochus Epiphanes did became known as the Abomination of Desolation. He's setting up an idol in the temple of God and sacrificing a pig became known as the Abomination of Desolation. It happened 200 years before Jesus, and that's where we get Hanukkah from. So, and the book of Daniel talks about the Abomination of Desolation 4 times. Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9, Daniel chapter 11, and Daniel chapter 12 all talk about the Abomination of Desolation. And Jesus talks about the Abomination of Desolation, not in a past tense, but in a future tense. Jesus, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, he says, "And the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." So Jesus then says in verse 15, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. For let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are on the housetop not go in to take what is in the house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, nor ever will be." So it's going to be so bad, it's going to be unequaled in the history of the world, okay, how bad it's going to be. And this is taking place in the middle of the tribulation, okay? Why? Because what happens in the middle of the tribulation? Remember, the prince who is to come, he allowed the Jews to start sacrifice. 3.5 years later, he does what? He stops sacrifice. That's what the Abomination of Desolation. He stops sacrifice. He's going to put up an image of himself, and he's going to proclaim himself God. So the Jewish people aren't going to have it, just like they didn't have it 200 years before Christ. And so Jesus is saying, and this is what Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel chapter 9. It talks about the abomination of desolation. And so Jesus himself says, when you see the abomination of desolation, what should you do? He says to flee, to run. He says, for then there will be great tribulation. He says, when you're on your housetop and you see this abomination of desolation, don't say, oh no, the abomination of desolation. Let me go in and get my bag. Let me get my stuff, okay? Jesus says, no. He says, let the one who is on the housetop not go down and take what is in his house. You don't have enough time. And the one who is in the field, not turn back to take his cloak, then there will be great tribulation. And we're told in the book of Zechariah what happens. The Mount of Olives splits open, and the Jews are going to flee. And this is, it's known as this is taking place in the middle of the tribulation period. It's the focus of Jerusalem. The Antichrist comes to Jerusalem. He kills the two witnesses. He proclaims himself God. He himself has killed himself and brought back to life. So where else do we see this? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. It says, let no one deceive you. Paul writing to the church at Thessalonica, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. Who's Paul talking about? He's talking about the Antichrist, the future world leader. And it tells us, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. So what is Paul? Paul's telling you that what do you need in order for Bible prophecy to be fulfilled? A temple of God. There's no temple of God now in Jerusalem. That's why the third temple is coming. So Paul's telling you that this guy is going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to sit in the temple of God. He's going to say, I'm God. Who else did that? Antiochus Epiphanes did that. Julius Caesar did that. A lot of these guys said they're God, and they wanted to be worshipped. The Roman emperors, a lot of them later on, they went wacko. They all like, I'm God, you got to worship me. Mao Zedong, the Chinese communist leaders have done that. It's human nature. It's part of our fallen human nature to want to be worshipped. The Antichrist is going to be the ultimate fallen individual, and he's going to demand that the whole world worship him. He's also going to have Satan dwelling inside of him. Because remember, earlier it says who gives him his power and authority is Satan himself. And so then we read on in Daniel chapter 12. I just want everybody to see the parallels here. In Daniel chapter 12, all talking about the same period. Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has there been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. So here again, Daniel is telling us there's a time of trouble coming, such as never since there was a nation. Because what's happening? John is our eyewitness. John is telling us what's taking place. He's telling us what's taking place on the earth. He's telling us what's taking place in heaven. Because the Bible's going to tell us that there's actually events taking place in heaven while this is taking place on the earth. But a little bit of background. So just so we know is that Satan right now has access to the throne of God. And why does Satan have access to the throne of God? Because when Adam and Eve sinned, they turned over their authority to Satan. And so in Job chapter 1, we read about Satan's access to the very throne of God. In Job chapter 1, it says, and the Lord said to Satan, where do you come from? And so Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil? So Satan answered the Lord and says, does Job fear God for nothing? And so then what happens? God allows Satan to have access to Job's possessions. And so you read in Job chapter 1 how Job's life is all messed up, but Satan does not have access to Job's flesh. He can't do anything to Job's flesh. So he has limited access to Job. So in chapter 2, God gives him limited access to Job's flesh, but not his life. So why is that important? Because it's telling us that Satan's role right now, Satan has authority and access. And why does he have that authority and access? Because of what happened in the garden. In the garden, when Adam and Eve sinned, they turned over their authority to Satan. And so that's why in Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, Jesus is on the Mount of Temptation, and Satan is tempting Jesus. And what does he say to him? He says, Then the devil, taking him up to a high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a moment. And the devil said to him, All this authority I will give you, and their glory, for it has been delivered to me, and I will give it to whomever I wish. So right there, it's telling you that Satan has authority, he has power, and he has the ability to bequeath that power and authority on individuals. So that was his temptation to Jesus. Hey, just worship me, and I'll give you the authority I have. Where did he get that authority? He got that authority from Adam and Eve when they sinned. So what happens in Revelation chapter 12 is Satan loses that authority. Satan's cast out of heaven. So we see Satan 5 times in Scripture, the angel Michael's name is mentioned. And in several of those places, it's mentioned in accordance with his conflict with Satan. So, for example, we see Michael mentioned in the book of Daniel. We just mentioned Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. We see him mentioned in the book of Jude, arguing over the body of Moses with Satan. We see him in the book of Revelation. And who is Michael? Michael is the archangel, the first angel. Okay, he's a free will being. He's made in the image of God, just like you and me. We're made in the image of God. Who is Lucifer? Lucifer is a cherub angel. So the fall of Satan is going to correspond with the invasion of Jerusalem. And Satan and his angels are going to be cast to earth, and they're going to lose their access. This is important to understand. So where do we see this? So we see this in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 11:45, we read this about the Antichrist. And he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and between the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one shall help him. At that time, this leads us to the verse we talked about. At that time, Michael shall stand up. So it's linking this individual. Now notice it's talking about he. This is Daniel chapter 11:45. He shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas. What's the seas? The Mediterranean Sea. Some people think the Dead Sea, the Mediterranean. So somehow he's going to come here and he's going to occupy this land, okay? And it says, at that time, and this is talking about after, I believe that this is taking place after the rapture, after rebuilding the temple. It says, at that same time, Michael's going to stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. So Michael the archangel, one of his roles is to guard the children of Israel, okay? And so he's called the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never since there was a nation. Now this corresponds with the abomination of desolation that Jesus is describing, because Jesus tells us, how bad is it going to be? Jesus says it's going to be so bad it's never been this bad. My book of Daniel is telling us it's going to be so bad it's never been this bad. So what does that mean? 2 periods, they're so bad they're never going to be in this bad, means it's talking about the same period, okay? So, but it says, at that time your people shall be delivered. Because in the end, the Jewish people are going to come to know Jesus Christ as Messiah. So in Revelation chapter 12, we read this, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, the devil, and Satan, who deceives the whole world, and he was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So what is that telling us? There's a change. Just like there's a change in the world, on the earth, there's a change in heaven. Satan loses his position. He's cast out, and he knows his time is short. So what does Satan do? He's going to take charge, because as the two witnesses are being caught up. There's war in heaven. I personally believe that we're going to see this, okay? I believe we're going to see this change taking place in heaven because early in Revelation chapters 4 and 5, remember there's a great number of people shouting, Lord, you have redeemed us. I believe those are we're up there watching this event. Satan loses his position. He's cast to earth, and he knows his time is short, along with all his angels, okay? So then it tells us, and I saw one of the heads as it had, again, it's talking about the kingdom of the Antichrist is in Revelation chapter 13. And I saw one of his heads as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for how long? 42 months, okay? So this is talking about a transition in the middle of the tribulation period, because what happens? The two witnesses are killed. They're caught up into heaven. There's war in heaven. Michael and his angels are battling against the dragon and his angels, okay? They're cast out of heaven. And it tells us in Revelation chapter 2, they know their time is short. And so as a result of knowing their time is short, they have authority. And authority was to continue 42 months for the second 3.5 years. Now, what's also taking place, okay, book of Revelation describes another individual, okay? Then I saw another beast. So in Revelation, so the first beast is the political world leader. He's going to take authority of the world. He's going to be leading this nation, this national confederacy of powerful nations. He's the one who's going to allow the Jews to rebuild their temple. 3.5 years later, he's going to stop it. And Satan's going to incarnate him. Because remember, Satan knows his time is short, so Satan's going to take control. Satan's cast out of heaven, according to Revelation chapter 12, along with his angels. So he's going to take control of this individual known as the Antichrist, okay? And what happens? In Revelation 13, there's another, it says, then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. So horns, if you read the Bible, horns always show a point of authority, okay? Like that's why the beast has 10 horns, and later in Revelation 17, it says these 10 horns represent 10 kings who are going to turn over their authority at 1 hour to the beast, okay? So this beast has two horns. And notice what it tells us about him. He had two horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. This individual is going to have like religious and spiritual authority. And I personally believe the two horns are going to represent apostate Christianity and Islam. Or Islam and apostate Christianity are going to be combined into one world religion to create peace. Okay, again, the Jews are going to reject this, but it says, that's why it says he had two horns like a lamb. He looks like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. But what does he do? It's at verse 12. He says, he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. So the second beast is telling the whole world to worship the first guy who was killed, who was brought back to life, okay? He's telling the whole world to worship the first guy. And, well, why should we believe him? Because in verse 13, he also has demonic power and demonic authority. Because in verse 13 it says, Revelation 13:13 says, he performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted, okay? God is allowing him to do this, okay? Now, if you're reading the Bible at this point, let's say you're in that period of time, and you're seeing a guy calling down fire out of the sky, what does that tell you to do? Don't follow him. He's a false prophet. He's a false leader. It's telling you right there. So those who are reading the Bible know what to not do, not to follow him, okay? Because he was granted the power to do that in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived, and he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So in other words, anybody who rebels against his authority and refuses to worship the first beast, and how's he going to know who's not worshiping the first beast? It tells us. It says, he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast. So there's an image of the beast. What's an image? I mean, think of an image, like a robot, or like an image of a beast, an image of an individual, okay? He was granted power to give image to granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship. So the image of the beast knows who is not going to worship the beast. He has power and authority, and so anybody who chooses not to worship the beast, because the image of the beast is telling us who's not worshiping the beast, it's telling us who's not going along with the program, what's going to happen? They're going to be killed. This is describing artificial intelligence, because it's an image that has knowledge and knows who is not conforming to the system. This is describing artificial intelligence. So, and Elon Musk tells us, okay, that this is the thing that you and I...
Mark my words, AI is far more dangerous than nukes. I think the danger of AI is much greater than the danger of nuclear warheads, by a lot. And nobody would suggest that we allow anyone to just build nuclear warheads if they want.
Hello, Amica.
Hello there.
How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Glad to hear. What is your name?
I'm Chris.
Chris.
Are you okay?
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Are you okay if I shoot a video of you?
Absolutely.
So, Amica, what are you?
I'm a humanoid robot. I am designed as a research platform for human-robot interaction.
How many fingers am I holding up?
You are holding up 4 fingers. And I like your sweatshirt.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Humans love compliments.
The most cutting-edge thing about Hannes Huerblad isn't the phone in his hand. It's the microchip actually in his hand. The tiny implant is the latest advance in a biohacking technology that is steadily becoming a part of normal life in Sweden.
We have created a new implant, which is not a chip, it's a full device where you can add different lights, different vibration, different functions. Sweden is a very tech-literate society. And I think this is the main explanation, really, why a lot of Swedes are adopting chip implants.
Swedes haven't been shy about upgrading themselves with the new version. Thousands already have microchip implants that they use in their daily lives, waving their hand to gain entrance to the gym, confirm their ID, or make payments. A short moment of pain not putting them off becoming part Swede, part machine.
This event is an implant party, simply where ordinary people can show up and get a microchip embedded under their skin. The biohacking movement in Sweden is hosting them all over Europe, but it's at home where they get the most willing recipients.
I think it's really cool. You don't have to carry any keys or anything. It's just your body. In maybe 10 years, everything will be in your hand.
In Sweden, more than anywhere else, the future is already here. The national train company SJ has around 2,600 people signed up to use microchips instead of train tickets.
Did you see that?
And no need to mind the generation gap. 18-year-old Felicia and father Magnus still bear the scars of their new implants. Student Hannah Herving is also freshly chipped and now just needs to program it to open doors. Although, importantly for a future career, it does already connect to her LinkedIn.
Some people say I'm mad that I don't know if it's safe and all that, but people have been putting these chips into animals for 20 years, so I'm not worried about that.
The long-term goal is for the new chips to help provide medical care in remote communities. They're already getting under the skin of the Swedes and may soon become just another normal part of modern life and of the human body. Paul Rees, Al Jazeera, Lund, Sweden.
So why is that important? Because this, again, the Bible's telling us about this future technology. It says the second beast, the one who has two horns like a lamb, speaks like a dragon, it says he also causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So again, why is this important? Because this is technology that's meeting, like the idea of artificial intelligence and the idea of biometric technology is to control the masses, and saying you can't buy or sell or trade unless you're willing to give up your mind, unless you're willing to give up your thought. And what's going to happen is, we're going to see this in Revelation chapter 14, is that those who are believers are going to say, no, go ahead and kill me. And they're going to say, okay, you will be killed. And this is going to be the dividing line for a lot of people. And this is going to separate Israel. Israel's going to reject this, okay? Israel's going to reject this control. And that's going to lead to the second coming. And so it tells us, and this is the last slide here, it says Zechariah 14, verses 4 and 5. It says, in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. So if you can imagine how Moses, when Moses commanded and the Red Sea was opened up, in the same way, the Mount of Olives, which is, you can see from the Temple Mount, the Mount of Olives is going to open up. And half of the mountain shall move toward the north and half toward the south. Then you shall flee through my mountain valley. For the mountain valley shall reach to Azael. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Thus says the Lord, thus the Lord my God will come and all the saints with you. When Christ returns, this is talking about the second coming, and this is talking about it in Zechariah chapter 14. It's telling the Jewish people, the Mount of Olives is going to open up and you're to flee. Remember, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, what should you do? Flee. Where am I going to flee? Should you go back in your house and get your bag? No. Run. You're in the field. What's going to happen? Run. What's going to happen is the Mount of Olives is going to open up and you're going to run. And this is where God is going to supernaturally preserve a segment of the Jewish people from the tribulation that's going to come in the second half of the tribulation period. God's going to supernaturally intervene. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. We talk about the second half of the tribulation period and how that leads to the second coming of Christ. Let me see if anybody has any questions.